There's a story about the psalm today, which was told me by a Welsh relative who said, and it may be apocryphal, that they were in church and there was a little old lady next to them who was looking intently at what the preacher had to say. And the preacher was a fiery Welsh preacher, and he was reading the psalm, and when he came down to "The wicked shall see it and be angry, they shall gnash their teeth in despair, the desire of the wicked shall perish," the little old lady tremulously raised her hand and said, "What if you don't have any teeth?" And the preacher said, "Teeth will be provided." Yes, well, that's not the point of the psalm, but still. It amused me, heaven knows. Do you know, there's a good reason why there are 4 Gospels. We've been doing, well, a few more than that, but why we have 4 Gospels in our Bible. We've been covering this repeatedly in Bible study. You know, there's a concern amongst many, perhaps when they first come to study the Scriptures, that the Gospels don't agree with each other, which is probably why there's 4 of them. Otherwise they would be identical documents. But the fact is, there are changes of tone, there are changes of nuance, there are changes of approach, there are different ways in which an occasion is described, and there's a good reason for it. Because when we look at today's reading from Luke, we have what you might call a pretty straightforward parable. And it's talking in practical terms without going off in great theological flights of fancy. Probably more practical than I would like. I like theological flights of fancy. I like the Gospel of John for that reason, because it is a theological gospel. But here in Luke, he's basically telling people what they should do, and I should imagine he's endearing himself enormously to the host who'd invited him there. You can imagine, can't you? You've got this person that everyone is saying is wonderful coming to your town, so you invite him to dinner. Despite the fact that you suspect he might be a bit of a firebrand, you invite him to dinner. And what does he do? First of all, he tells your guests that basically they're going about it completely the wrong way and that they're courting the damnation of their eternal souls because they're trying to puff themselves up and go to the place of honor first. And then he turns his attention to the host, the person who's providing him with all these wonderful things, and says, "And don't invite a whole bunch of rich people and luminaries to your parties, because they'll just invite you back. There's no gift involved if you know you're going to get it back. It's just, you know, an endless game of pass the parcel, musical chairs." And it's just occurred to me, you might have neither of those games in America. You do? Wonderful, thank you. You do have pass the parcel? No, the musical chairs, wonderful. Pass the parcels, but no, I'm not going to go into that. But suffice it to say that if you, this is a recurring theme in the Gospels, if you give to those who you know are going to give back, and if you only love those who you know are going to love you, if you only forgive those who you think are excusable, then we're not really doing any of those things, are we? You know, we can convince ourselves that we're being bountiful and we're being generous, but we're not doing them as a leap of faith. We're doing them with calculation at the root. You know, oh, I like these people, I want them. I want to give them stuff, you know. I want them to think well of me. So I'll give them stuff and they'll think well of me. So Jesus made the host and the guests probably feel very uncomfortable, probably angry too. Yeah, because your initial response in that situation would be to defend yourself. You know, if you were being told this by this slightly strange guest, you'd want to defend yourself. Say, "Oh no, I'm not doing that." But that's where humility must come in, because defense of the ego never stops. You know, defense of self never ends. You know, that's slavery. That really is slavery. That will take you to a miserable place. It will keep you there for the rest of your life, and it will drive you. And it will drive you to work all the hours that God sends. It will drive you to get into arguments and rows. It will drive you to a whole bunch of things. And trust me, humility is not the difficult thing that God is presenting here, like putting you in sackcloth and ashes and beating you about the head and making you crawl on your stomach like a worm. No, humility is a big part of that redemption that is being offered by Christ. Humility is, oh, thank God, I no longer have to defend myself all the time. In the quietness of my own soul, we shouldn't have to be constantly defending ourselves. You know, it helps, I think, when it comes to talking about humility, to keep a reasonable sense of our space in the universe. So let me give you a few facts and figures. Where did I write them down? Oh yes, here we go. I find comfort in the fact that I am only as much of God's creation as the space I fill. I've been thinking deeply about this issue over the last week. I'm only as much of God's creation as the space I fill. Because sometimes we see ourselves as inflated bubbles of interest and importance surrounded by emptiness, with occasional bubbles knocking about who are other people who we happen to put value on. But you know, the old idea that we were on a rock surrounded by empty space, quantum physicists tell us that that's completely nonsense. The whole universe is fizzing with quantum activity, with things happening on a scale far too small for us ever to understand what's going on. What I'm trying to say is there is no empty space, there is no waste, there is no, this isn't God's creation and this is. This is all creation. Now I find comfort in the fact that yes, I am no more of God's creation than any other part, the size of me, 6'6" tall or whatever. But in the same way, because none of God's creation is accident or mistake or error or trash or garbage, it means that every single part of it was created with as much importance as the whole. That every part of God's creation was created with as much design and intent, as much joy and love, as much as a work of art or play as any other part. So my part is infinitesimally small, but it is much a part as that creation of God as the center of our sun, or as stardust a million light years away. We like to think of ourselves as isolated creatures in many ways, because if we are isolated creatures, then we can filter what comes to us. We can filter our interactions with other people. Well, do you know that it's a statistical certainty that in each of your lungs there is at least one molecule of air that was breathed in by Jesus, or a molecule of air that was breathed in by Cleopatra, or a molecule of air that was breathed in by one of those other great luminaries of the past. The fact is, we don't really have any separation at all. The fact is, we are part of this universe. We are not a discrete package of creativeness. We are part of the created universe. Now, what am I going on about? I had something of a spiritual experience. I'm having those on a fairly regular basis. About once every 6 months, I can usually put myself down for a spiritual experience. And this was when I went up to the Sequoia National Park. Wonderful, at the beginning of last week. And you will have those times in your life sometimes whereby you just seem to glimpse the light through the veil. And through the glimpsing of that light, it lights up everything else, and you can see where you are in the room. Well, I was coming down off the mountains, and I tend to think of myself as being, a thing that moves through the universe, moves through the air, moves through life, you know? I'm a body with skin. I am a discrete and distinct human being. And I move through the air in the same way that a ship moves through water, you know? Definitely separate. And you deal with obstacles as they come up, and you part the waters as you go along, and then they close around behind you, you know, and it's a way of thinking which has just been so obvious to me. I haven't ever really thought about it, you know. And I was coming down that mountain, and for a moment, that way of thinking of myself disappeared. And instead, I saw myself as, how can I describe this? Instead of being a brick wall, more like a stained glass window. Instead of being a piece of iron, more like a sponge, that this creation was passing through me instead of around me. That I realized that I was deeply and profoundly a part of it and not separate from it. Now, that brought to me a feeling of great humility, but not the sort of humility which is linked to shame, which is linked to regret, but the sort of humility which is just seeing reality and taking joy in it. I found it intensely joyful experience. Now, I have assured people I've told this story to that I had neither had drinks or drugs. And it was a pure response to my spending time in that place of beauty and spending time in prayer and thinking of God. And it was a glimpse of reality, which I'm going to take with me to my grave now, you know. I am not this sealed body passing through and pushing to one side creation and other people. And it's just not like that. We are all as much a part of creation as anybody else, and as much a part of creation as all of creation. So humility is a difficult one to try and describe. We are part of this universe which is ridiculously large, and sometimes when we look at our tininess compared to overall size of creation, it's an intimidating thing. And it's easier just to go back to the way of looking at the world which we were born with or brought up with. But we're called to more than that. We are basically called to one of those difficult conversations that Jesus had with the host and with the guests in today's gospel. We are called to be on the receiving end of that, but to be on the receiving end in our own way, in ways which are pertinent to us. Now, I felt very strongly that that experience which I had coming down the mountains from the Sequoia National Park was one of those moments when I received that word, that it's not about me trying to arrange things so that I'm the most important person in the space. It's not about me trying to arrange my life so that things are to my liking. It's not about me trying to arrange the world around me so that things are easier for me. It is about stepping out in faith, and stepping out in the faith that this world in which we inhabit is part of us and we are part of it. So, let me just get to the end. Whether we like it or not, we are caught up in the center of this supreme act of our God, the creator of all things. We are not separate from it. We cannot separate ourselves from it. And therefore, humility is effectively just seeing that we cannot be separate. It's understanding the truth. It's getting away from this idea that we're somehow able to create God in our own image and creation in our own image, and not the other way around. So, try as we might, we can't get away from it, nor should we. Jesus, who was often a great deal more practical than I am, tells this story in our gospel today in terms of very human concerns. He takes the brokenness of status seeking and uses that as the basis of his allegory, his parable. And status seeking comes from fear, and he turns it on his head, telling the listener that exalting themselves in company will lead to a correction that they didn't seek, and therefore to embarrassment. Showing deference to others and not seeking preferment may well lead to a gathering into the presence of the host, or in reality, to God, and this will be joyful. So Jesus is basically telling us that if we don't seek humility in our lives, if we don't seek that truthful relationship with others in our lives, it's going to happen to us anyway. And if we don't seek it, it will be imposed from outside by reality. And that's going to be embarrassing and troubling and traumatic. So what he talks about in brief there is, of course, the idea of going to a dinner party and being told, no, actually, I've got Prince of Wales coming, can you go and sit over there? And instead, what we should be doing is thinking, well, there's bound to be somebody of great importance. I'll go and sit over there. I'm fine with sitting over there. There's no problem with it. I'm not trying to pump myself up. And then the host, or in this case, God, comes to you and says, come and sit by me. Again, there's this paradox that those who seek humility are often lifted up, and those who seek to lift themselves up are shown humility. And being shown humility is a great deal less comfortable than finding it yourself. So going on from here, humility is, to me, the key bedrock for our faith lives. We cannot achieve what we seek without first seeking humility, because it will mean that everything else that we seek is based on a falsehood. If we do not accept our true place in the universe and find joy in that, but we think of ourselves as some extraordinary, grand, or protected personality, who is either protected by wealth or by their great faith or by their great status, then sooner or later we're going to be shown the truth. And if we're seeking a truthful relationship with a God that is true, then without humility that's going to be meaningless, because that God will forever elude us. We cannot find truth whilst living in a lie. So going forward from here, let's just look at that word as being less than terrifying, as being something that we want to achieve. Humility as the wellspring of growth.